Welcome to Taking the Tradition On. There are various just housekeeping things that I always have to say at the beginning. So the first is thank you very much to the Arts Council England, who have really made my life much easier during lockdown, as I was already working on an Arts Council project around Duncan Williamson, digitising his tapes and then having time to listen to those tapes. Duncan Williamson was an amazing Scottish traveller, storyteller. He was my mentor and an amazing tradition bearer for the Scottish travelling people. So lockdown has been great for me because it's given me more time to revisit my apprenticeship with him and to listen to those stories and to think about them and to talk and discuss with other people about them as well, which is how this programme has started off, taking the tradition on. And Duncan is usually getting a very good mention in these. Some are focusing more on Duncan than others. I think he will definitely be cropping up at least one point tonight. But taking the tradition on is starting to move out into the tradition generally. And tonight, my guest is the amazing, I'm going to put you up, Mike, but you're not allowed to say anything yet because I'm going to big you up for a while. My guest is the amazing
Keep
Mike
to the
Russ.
truth.
So I would not be a storyteller, I don't think, if it wasn't for Mike Russ, because I was exceptionally lucky.
That's not right for starters.
I'm going to mute you. I am going to mute you, Mike Russ. You are not allowed to say anything for a little while. I'm going to make sure I'm muting me rather than you. Right. Yeah, I've shut him up. I love the power of Zoom. It's a marvelous thing. I would not be storytelling if it wasn't for. I'm gonna even get rid of him now because he's just dancing around. I came to storytelling. The first person I heard was Taffy Thomas at a local folk festival when I was 13. But at that point, there really weren't any storytelling clubs. Storytelling was very hidden. I loved stories. I kept reading books that had storytellers in them and going, why aren't there any storytellers anymore? And then when I saw storytelling workshop on a folk program, on a folk festival program, I was like, they're really real. And Taffy introduced me to Mike Rust, and Mike Rust with Richard Walker were just about to set up the first story round in England. The Crick Crack Club was running in London, but that was more of a performance thing, and it was in London. I live in Shropshire, and it was because of where I live and the fact that I was able to go to that club that this wonderful world of storytelling opened out. And I'm very lucky because at that point I was 14, and over my lifetime storytelling has just grown in popularity, and more and more clubs and festivals, and the whole scene has kind of happened, the modern scene, in my lifetime. And Mike Rust has been a really big part of all of that. So I'm going to welcome you in. I'm going to let you speak now, and I'm going to let people see you. Right, there you go. You've been desperate to talk. You can talk now.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here.
So I'm really interested. I mean, obviously I managed to get into storytelling because you were there and you set up the club. What got you into storytelling? How did you discover stories? Where were they?
Right. There's a short answer and there's a long answer. So tonight you might get both. But the short answer is I was married and I was living in Ledbury, which is in Herefordshire. And I was working for the Forestry Commission. And on a Sunday morning, I had a Morris 1000 pickup. And we used to borrow the wood from the forest. When I had enough, I cut it up for a load of blocks, we used to call it, which is what you call logs for the log burning fires. And I go and sell it on a Sunday morning, one load. Now, I did it again about 3 weeks ago, and it's £100 in today's money. So whatever £100 was in 1978, I got that, and that was the beer money, probably for about the month or 6 weeks, whenever long it was. And when I'd finished doing that, I went to a pub. Now, the pub was the Verson's Arms, and it was the Verson Hotel, and it's it's on the road from basically Worcester to Hereford, and I could walk there. And I went in there at 12 o'clock. Now, it's a very posh hotel. It was in them days and everything else, but they had a bar. And in the bar, they liked the locals coming in. And it didn't matter if you'd been working or anything else. And it gave it a bit of an ambience, is what the bloke said. So I went in there and I put the chainsaw down and I parked my little truck up round the back. And I walked in. And there was a fella called Davy Jones, who turned out to run the Bromley Hard Folk Festival. Hodges Dump, that was a Cayley band, and one or two others, having a session in the bar because the landlord was paying them in cider. So I walked in there and I thought this was wonderful. There were squeeze boxes and violins and they were singing their heads off and everything else. And I went and found Lynn, and Lynn hadn't got up. It was about 12 o'clock. And so I went back. She didn't want to come. So I went back and they said to me, why don't you come and join the local Morris team, which was the Ledbury Morris men in them days, turned into the Silurian later on. And so I went and did that. And that was in the March that happened. Now that September, they had a harvest home in a village called Putley, which is in just around the corner from there. And in them days, and they still do, Amy, they sit down and have a 3-course meal. And it's always apple pie. And it's always at the end of sort of September, beginning of October. And there was a proper duchess there. I remember that bit. And a fella called Dougie Isles, his name was, who was a builder from the Forestry Dean, great big chap, 18 stone in his stocking feet, 6'2" and everything else. No one had told him he couldn't tell stories. So he stood up and he said, I'm going to tell a few stories. And he told 2 or 3 stories. One was Yam the cricketer. One was the miners knocking in the mines. You know the story about the miners here knocking in the mines and everything else. And the third one was a monologue.
I know a version of it. I might be getting the full version of it from you later.
Yeah, it's that one. And he did a thing called Who Killed the Bear, which is the same story as the Hartlepool monkey, but it happened in the Forest of Dean, which is a monologue. But to this day, if you go down into the Dean and you walk into the parish of Brevels and you walk into a pub and you go, who killed the bear? That starts the fight, right? So that's, and then the Morris teams were going out and they used to go out on a Thursday night, which was 2 pubs, and the last pub was a session. And so I started telling stories then, and Davy Jones would knock on the table with a glass and he'd go, pray quiet for the storyteller. And the first time he did it to me, everybody in the pub just sat down. And you'll remember the first time that you went out, Amy. This was at the White Horse at Checkley, because I remember it to this day, because I was absolutely terrified. But he didn't tell me he was going to do it. So, and I went, great, a storyteller. So I sat down with everybody else. He said, come on, Mike, you're on. So I had to stand up and tell a story in front of about 40 people who were at the 2 minutes before had been singing their heads off, singing a sea shanty or something. And it was just a change of the ambience of the evening and stuff like that. And there was and then a few poets would turn up.
What did you tell? Because I bet you remember. Everybody remembers their first story.
Well, I told Black Vaughan, because what happened next, what happened after I met Dougie Isles was that I talked to someone I knew and they said, go and see this old chap. Now, I'm pretty certain his name was Peter, but he was in the Swan at Kington. So in my old car, we went, Lynn, I said, come on, let's go to Kington. So off we poddled up to Kington. And I found this chap. And I said, you said you were a storyteller. And he said, well, I tell a few stories from time to time. I said, will you tell me some? I want to tell some. And he said, well, we trade stories, fellow, he called me. You have to give me a story and then I'll tell you another one. So I only knew one story, and that was the one that Dougie had just told me. Right? So I told him that one and he told me Blackburn. And so I started telling Blackburn, and then all the other ones were going around where they were little ghosty stories in them days mainly. And there was all sorts of stuff that came. And once I'd started doing it, people came and found me, and especially out the Morris teams. The year later, we went back to the same pubs. 1 or 2 people came up and said, did you tell that story last year? Do you know this one? And do you know about the water maid in the River Wye? And da, da, da. So gradually, people started telling me stories. But that's the short version, right? So how long we got? No, about 3 hours for the long version, right? Okay.
Well, we've got about nearly an hour.
Right. Okay. But see, you've got to remember that my dad was an after-dinner speaker. Now, he was in the round table in the Rotary, and Mum was in ladies' circle, and there was another chap in our family called Dick Carter. And just then there was another chap called Reg Barry. Now, Reg Barry was a farmer from Elmley Castle under Breeden Hill. Dick Carter owned his own business. He was an electrician and he employed about 4 people. His dad was a chief executive for Wychavon County Council. And they did a lot of banter and telling jokes. And when Dad was doing his after dinner speaking, and he got quite famous about it, he'd take the stories that we know, or some of the stories that we'd heard of and stuff, and make them shorter. So he'd hear a longer story and he'd make it shorter. But when I was in my teenage years, one of the visitors at our house was a chap called Blaster Bates. Now, I've never spoken about Blaster very much, not even to you. You know I knew him, but because he came to the Second Fete. But Blaster, if you look at him on YouTube, which I have done just recently because of this, was a man of his own time. He was the only person I knew who thought apartheid was a good idea. You know, he was
definitely a man of his own time. And if you choose to go and have a look at him, there's lots of alerts and lots of swearing alerts as well.
Yeah, I don't actually go and watch him live on YouTube anymore, and I knew the old bugger, right? But he did a lot of good stuff with it, and he's got 5 or 6 videos. He's got some long playing radio records and all sorts of stuff. And some of the stories that he did, like the shower shit over Cheshire and stuff, and the widening of the A40 and 1 or 2 things, you can still hear.
The shower is the one is one of my abiding memories from the Second Fete. I have to.
Yeah, yeah, right. So I was brought up with all this, and we were swapping, and the jokes we told I don't tell anymore for the same reasons I don't listen to Blaster Bates. You know, I'm 65 now, and I was 15 in those days, 14, 15 and 16. But when I looked into it, we also went to Cornwall a lot. And before Dougie Isles spoke, Dad and I spoke about this quite a few times back later on in the 90s. And there were 3 or 4 stories we knew before Dougie Isles had started me off. So there were some I could jump back to. One was King Mark of Cornwall, the one how the man got in the moon, because we spent a lot of time down there, and Dad had picked that up down in the London Inn in Padstow. And I picked another Cornish one up from a fellow called John LaFish, who's still going apparently by all accounts, by Mo Keast. He must be well old by now. He was a fisherman from down there. And he used to play the guitar, and he'd tell a few stories and monologues and things in the pubs around Padstow. And so it was all sort of bubbling around, but I left home. I lived in France. I got married, and we bought a house. But it was that going into the Verson's Arms that kicked it all off, really. And when I was 23. Okay. That's
brilliant, because that was one of the things. I mean, we know each other sort of quite well, and we've known each other for a long time now.
Yeah.
But that was one of the things. I mean, I kind of assumed that storytelling had always been part of your life, but I did wonder if there was kind of a definite key moment where there was a decision made that you were actually going to go, this is something I want to do, and I'm going to find out more about it. But it sounds in lots of ways like that collecting was pretty easy for you, because you were sort of the only person telling stories. People who had stories just came and found you.
Well, and Chris Movey was around, and he was singing songs, and John Willie was there, and he was playing music, and then they would find the same things. The Morris men, it was all to do with the blackface Morris men down in Herefordshire, and we go to these little villages, and there was a stir in the village as we got there, because this hadn't been done since before the First World War. Now, you're talking about the early 80s, 78, 79, 80, around then. And so when we went to one of the villages, I think it was Dilwyn, when the pubs closed at 11 o'clock, but we had this song, and we asked the landlord to stay open. It was a shanty, and David Jones had changed the words. And the landlord would say, well, I never open late, but because the Morris men were here, we'll open for another couple of hours. So every Thursday we went out, and we wouldn't leave the pubs till 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, because every pub would stay open because the Morris men were there. You know, and stuff like that. So there was and people would come out and watch. I don't know if they still do it to this day, but you had to sort of have your own tour, and you had to you have to go around the week before and put your posters up and things like that. But that's how David Jones did it. And it's also how he gained people to come into the team, like me and 1 or 2 other people. Now, Davey, in them days, he was 38. He was married, he had a mortgage, and he was well old. He really was, because everybody else was in their early 20s. And we thought he was well old. You know, I'd been married for 6 weeks, let alone, you know, I had 4 children. He was married to Sandra, and he lived round the corner.
I'm just going to point out that this is where Mike's going into story realm.
Yeah, well...
Lynn is in the room next door. He's booted her out and locked the door so that she can't heckle. And I'm just waiting for Lynn to get on the phone, and there's suddenly going to be an absolute tirade on the chat of her starting to heckle this.
No, well, it was. You know, Lynn and I were in our early 20s. You know, have you made 40 yet? You know. and all that. And Davey, but he was running Bromyard Folk Festival at the time, and it was his idea to do Sunday stories and Sunday songs. And I was well pleased because I wasn't going to pay me any money, but he gave me a free ticket for the family. So he gave me and Lynn a free ticket, and we had one for the Morris men anyway. But it was actually, I got a contract which was an artist contract. I think I kept it because it was the first one I ever got, you know. And I had to go and do Sunday songs and Sunday stories with Fred Jordan and a choir from Worcester or somewhere upstairs in the Falcon. And that was the one that really kicked it off. Well, because Taffy Thomas was there. Taffy came down, and he'd had his heart attack. And I knew Taffy vaguely beforehand, and he'd had his heart attack. And so at one point, very early on, as Taffy would probably admit nowadays, he only knew 5 or 6 stories. He'd been up to see Betsy White, he'd been down to see Ruth Tongue, and he came and he was sat there alongside me, and we were swapping stories and stuff. And that was quite a few years before the club started. So Bromyard was that part of my. Then I moved up to Shropshire, and I was still in the Morris teams. I was in the Iron Men and Seven Guilders and stuff all through the 80s. But some parts of the 80s, I'm the same as you. Jake came along, Lynn was working, I was working, So if you look back, 83, 84, 85, 86, I was still telling stories and collecting them, but I wasn't.
Young children.
Yeah, we had children and young children and fitting them into the family and all the rest of it. So.
So John's on the chat, and everybody else, you're very welcome to be on the chat. If you haven't already discovered it, if you kind of look down at the bottom, you'll find like a little bubble that says chat. If you want to open that up. John the Fish is asking, John Rowe is asking if John the Fish went to Cambridge Folk Festival in the early 80s or 70s. I have
no idea.
And that, because that was a different,
John the Fish was a fisherman from Padstow. I don't think he left Cornwall. I know Malcolm tried to book him to go to Yorkshire, but he wouldn't. I don't think he's left Cornwall in his life. I'd be surprised if he had much. You'll have to ask Mo Keast. I'll write it down. Okay. Right. Well, yeah. So that's how that got started. So there I was in Shropshire as a storyteller, floating around the place, still picking up odd stories from here and there.
But yeah, so storytelling was starting to pick up, and it was starting to get known a little bit as a thing, and people were being booked as storytellers at folk festivals, though still in quite rare amounts. Right. And I think Taffy did a huge amount for that, didn't he? Because he was so well known on the folk scene before he had his stroke, that when he came up with this idea of being a storyteller, people listened to him and they booked him because he was Taffy and because he was amazing and he'd been in Magic Lantern and lots of other things. So I think he did do quite a lot to kind of open that door at folk festivals.
Right.
But what gave you the idea to start a storytelling club? Because that seems like quite a strange thing to do.
Right. Okay. It got to about 87 and the Iron Men and Guilders got booked at Sidmouth Folk Festival down in Sidmouth in Devon, and they had the bench at the Volunteers, which is still there to this day. And I called in there, and there was Packy Byrne. It's the first time I met Packy Byrne, was there telling stories with somebody else, a young lady, and I was still in my kit, so I sat and told a story, and it was one of the Saint stories. It was St. Hugh of Lincoln. It was one of those, Amy. I've got half a dozen of those. And in 1988 I got booked at Sidmouth because of that. Because by then they had a storytelling bench, but and it was Alan Berman, and he was looking for storytellers to book. And because I'd done one the year before, someone had gone and told him. And so he phoned me up and he asked me if I'd come down as the storyteller for the week at Sidmouth. And I did that for 3 years in a row. And in those years, that's what
that will get you to know some stories pretty quickly then.
Yeah, well, I certainly had enough to do the first couple, and I met Mike Dacre, and Cybermouth was kicking off about then because they were all meeting at a youth camp just down the road. And
yeah, so it wasn't Cybermouth at that point, but the Mouth, which for those people who don't, because people might not know what the Mouth is. Yeah. So it's great. We've got Janice here from the States, and we've got Norman here from Canada. So these are things that people won't know. So the Iron Men and Seven Guilders is the Morris side. The Iron Men. It's a Morris dance team.
The Iron Men were the men, and the seven, and there was the Iron Women, who were known as the Seven Guilders, and it's the Guilders that paint the gold on the Iron Bridge, is where that comes from. And they dance the ladies' dances, and the men. Yeah, and they were a big famous team in England.
Absolutely. Sidmouth is another folk festival.
Yeah.
And there was something else that you said that I was just going to point. Oh, what was it we were going to?
The Mouth.
The Mouth. So the Mouth is was a collection of storytellers, because storytellers were quite sort of few and far between, really. And so they all, a lot of them gathered at one particular kind of, it was like a summer camp, and there was quite a lot of families there, and they got to meet each other around the fire. And so it became, in those days, there wasn't an internet, which is bizarre how quickly that's changed.
Well, yeah, okay.
Much more of a newsletter. People would put articles in, and it was a newsletter between a group of maybe about 20
I did that. Yeah, I did that. Yeah. So anyway, so I was meeting other storytellers by then. So I did Sidmouth for 3 years, and then Tales of the Edge got started, and I met Richard Walker because my son needed.
Hang on a minute, because that's the important bit. Tales of the Edge getting started. See, I think this is very important.
Right.
Because this is where I come in. What made you start Tales at the Edge? How did you meet Richard Walker, and why did you decide to have a storytelling club?
Right. When I came back from Sidmouth, I decided I'd go to the local folk club and tell all the stories I knew. And I keep going every week. It was on a Thursday evening, and I go every week and I tell one story in the first half. Now, the average folk song is about 4 minutes. So, and everybody got 2 songs. So a lot of the stories were put on purpose to 8 minutes or so long. And I go and do the first half, and it was a club over in Shifnal. And I went over there and I did 4 in a row, and they turned around to me and they said, well, you're interfering with the singing. We don't really want that kind of stuff there. And I was fuming, right? I know you have, I've never told many people this, but I came out, I bought 2 bottles of beer, and I knew Richard by then. So I stopped to the phone box, phoned him up and said I was calling in, and it was about 9:30 at night. So I took 2 bottles of beer in, and we sat down, and it was then, that was the day Tales of the Edge was born. Right, so I went to the pub that night, which was about 10:30. The pub's closes at 11. It was the UK back in then. And I saw Steve, and he said, you'll have it on a Monday night because we don't do food, and you can have the room for free. And so when do you want the first one? And so the first one was going to be the Monday after Bromyard Folk Festival, which is in the September. And Taffy was booked because I phoned up Davy Jones, who was now turned into a very good friend of mine, and said, right, can you book Taffy? Because I want him for the club. And he goes, yes, I'll book Taffy for you. So he booked Taffy, and then he paid to go to Bromyard because we didn't have any money. So we phoned up Taffy and persuaded him to do the club on the way home for his lunch. So he got a pint of cider and a cheese sandwich. Yeah, okay.
So
and now
we're very generous and willing to do those sort of things and support new clubs and support new ventures. So fair play, Taffy. And it all worked out perfectly for me because you'd lost my phone number. We'd met in June, and I'd got all really excited about the fact that there was a storytelling club that's starting, and it just vanished. So I met you at Bromyard, and you did to me exactly what Davy Jones did to you, because I met you on the Sunday and went, the first one's tomorrow. You're going to tell a story, aren't you? Yeah. So I spent the rest of the festival panicking like nobody's business, trying to get the story ready for the next day.
And you were 15?
No, I was 14 because I had only just had my birthday, which meant that I was legally allowed to be at the club, because in those days you had to be 14 to go into the pub.
Right, okay.
And Steve, to be fair, was pretty hot on all the rules and regulations. And Steve also, I mean, was a huge supporter of the club. I mean, I don't think it would have been nearly as successful without Steve's help. I mean, he was an absolute bastion, really.
No, and as the owner of the pub, he was great. He did get some benefits out of it later on.
Yeah, he did. It came back to greet, he got some really good stuff later on, but he had the faith in it at the beginning.
Right. And when we mentioned to him when you weren't there that you were only 14, he went, well, she's taller than you are. She looks 18. She'll be all right. Okay.
Yeah, I was getting a lift with my dad, so there was an awful lot of Diet Coke involved.
Yeah. And your dad was my friend, Brian Dougal, who's my best friend probably now. But he's 6'2", is he 6'3", something like that. And anyway, so that wasn't a bother, the fact that you were 14. So
it was awful.
So then we started the club, and we started the club in 88, I think. Was it, or 89? Something like that, anyway. I can't quite remember. I think it was 88, but I'll have to check anyway. So the pub's
89.
closed now. 89.
I only
And
know because I know how old I was.
yeah, and the pub's closed now. Okay. And so that the club was now 30 years old. We had the celebration, didn't we? Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I was being slightly distracted. Yeah, I'm not the only person who was tall and getting away with being in the pub.
We're
So
wooden show and
I
Jackstees
don't
anyway.
want to share that with everybody because you haven't put it to attendees, but I'm going to rat you out anyway. So
I
yeah,
haven't
Linda
said
was
anything.
away with being in the pub underage because she was tall. And just a reminder, so thanks to Shane and Heather, if you put it to all attendees, everybody will get it. And
Yeah, let everybody see it. Let everybody see. Come on. Right. Okay.
We're all friends here.
Right.
So there we were, and it was it was a really exciting time for storytelling. And I think that, I mean, you were incredibly supportive to everybody who was getting interested in storytelling at that point. And I think you were in touch with Taffy, you were in touch with Davy, you were in touch with Sidmouth Folk Festival. And certainly from my point of view, it seemed to be quite quickly that we were asked to go and do things because it's quite an unusual thing to be storytelling. And we also got to be, which is organised by you, I just rode on your coattails really. It was a time when lots of new clubs were starting.
Yeah, they were all over the place. Yeah. We tried to go to a lot of them in the early days. We went up to Stubbings Wharf for the first one there. I went up to Lancashire for the first one there. I went to 2 or 3 for the first ones because we were trying to sort of reach out to people, and we were thinking about having a festival at the same time. So and we were just interested as well. So we try and go to places. Yeah, Nottingham we went to.
Oh, yeah, we went to the trip to Jerusalem
With Roy Dyson. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah.
No, really, it was quite quick because it was only 2 years before, it was 2 years the first festival was on from the club starting. So with all the organisation and everything, Festival at the Edge started when I was 16. So that would be 91.
Right.
It's terrible that my birthday is just the calendar that all of this hangs on.
Well, yours and Richard's, because Richard's birthday was about the same. And we found Stokes's barn because Jake was in the Cub Scouts in Wenlock, and and Arthur Hill had just refurbished the barns up, and Lynn decided that it was a Sunday afternoon, so we went and watched Jake do scouty things on he had mountain bikes. They found mountains for them to ride over. He was about 7 in them days. And we went into the barn, had a cup of tea, and it was Lynn who said, you could have a festival here, to be fair. And so we did. Say it quickly, 30 odd years can pass.
Yes. Yes, I know. So it's 30 years. It's 30 years since the first Tales at the Edge Storytelling Club.
Yes.
And so that's sort of a bit of the background, and we might also come back to the setting up of the Society for Storytelling, various other things. But I'm really interested in over those 30 years. I think that the storytelling scene has obviously just changed drastically.
Yeah.
And now it's really formal. So we've got storytelling festivals, we've got storytelling clubs, people call themselves a storyteller, people have jobs being a storyteller. I mean, that's how I make my living. I get booked as a storyteller. And I don't know if that is something that has been good for the tradition or wiped it out and smothered it. Because that's certainly not how the tradition was at all 30 years ago. And whether that tradition was already dying out or whether this kind of so-called resurgence and flowering actually kind of smothered the traditional root side of it, I don't know. And I'd be really interested to know what you think about that.
Well, what I thought then and what I think now, it's slightly different. But then there were 3 types of storytellers. There was, it came down to being the fireside storytellers is what the name we use nowadays is. But I call them more folky storytellers who didn't need a theatre to sit in. You could tell stories under trees and by rivers and tell and all sorts of things. The theatre lot, known as the arty people, and they were basically based down in London, a lot of them, needed a theatre. And so what they'd need to do is to, anytime that we got together with them, they would set the room out as a theatre. They had chairs and circles in front of them and they want to stand on a pallet or something like that. And I never bothered doing all that kind of stuff. And the third ones were weren't quite as well highlighted in them days were the people from the libraries. And they were led by Grace Holsworth. And Grace would, overnighting, she called it, but she'd go off from Bedfordshire, is it Hertfordshire or Bedfordshire, where she was the chief librarian? And she'd go up to other schools and she'd meet other librarians. And it was her role. And what she used to say is, we'll take the stories out of the books and make them live again, which is how she used to put it. And I got that from her. She said, when a story goes into a book, it gets captured. And when I take it out of a book and I tell it, I release it again. I quote her now, but I've quoted her a lot over the years. I had a lot of time for Grace. Oh, she's still alive, I must say. Anyway, so they were the three parts of the storytellers. All right. Now, I've added a fourth one over the years, mainly because I know someone called Jess Wilson. And so she has created a whole, it's for me in my world, a new category of storytelling altogether, and it's care and well-being, and in brackets, making the world a better place, because that's what she does. And it's a healing type of story, or an ecos type of story. And I think that should be a category by itself nowadays, because there's a lot of people, Lisa Snyder down on Dartmoor, and people like that. And they are in this particular sort of branch of storytelling, if that's the right expression. So that's changed over 30 years, because that didn't even exist 30 years ago. So there's a fourth one now. So that's how I see the storytelling scene. And now pretty much from where I was when I was 25, and now I'm 65, job pretty much done, Amy. You know, every county has a storytelling club. Every county has a book the history press have done, have collected all the stories. There's storytelling everywhere you look. You used to say, what do you do for a hobby? Oh, I'm a storyteller. And they, oh, that's interesting. What does that happen? Nowadays they go, I'm a storyteller. They go, oh, so am I. Yeah, that's the main difference. Okay.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. What I suppose I'm interested about is there always seems to be this thing that people say that storytelling is dying out, that traditional storytelling is dying out, that it's not being passed among the community anymore. And I mean, I've been working on a project, you know, with Montgomeryshire folktales with the Desnally myth stories, and there was a book published by the school in Newtown, by the history department of the folktales, because in 1947 they were worried that children didn't know the stories about the place where they live because they weren't being passed on within the community anymore. And I've just done a project because we're still at the same place in 2017. So whether it's always, well, or certainly for a long time, been on that cusp, and actually it does go on, but the whole point about that sort of tradition is that it's not widely seen. It is from one person to another person, and it's not within the big umbrella of storytelling or performance. It's just done quite quietly and secretly.
Well, what happens to me is, and it's happened a lot, and it happened to me 2 weeks ago. I went, there's an agricultural supplies shop that supply all the farmers, and I needed some bits and pieces for my decking. So I went in there, and the guy who works behind the counter said, Mike, he said, I've got a little story I want to tell you. And I go down to my local pub to play dominoes with from time to time, and we will go up into the hills in Shropshire to the Crown at Wentnor and places like that. And because I'm known as a storyteller, and where Val Littlehales lives, Amy, up through there. And there's a fellow up there called Jobber and another called John T. And those two fellows know Anna, my daughter. And they came and sat down, and it's just, we played our dominoes. We've got an hour to spare. There's a log fire and a couple of pints of beer in an old, beautiful pub in Shropshire. And they start talking about stories. And the reason they're talking about stories because I'm there, because they know I'm interested. But it's just the reason to do it. Sometimes you just have the reason to do it. You know, sometimes they talk about the football, sometimes they talk about the cricket, sometimes they talk about the royal family or the government or COVID-19, whatever it is. And sometimes they'll just sit there and go, oh, do you remember this? Or do you remember that? And that's the giant stone up there. Or if you go to the churchyard, there's a gravestone in the churchyard just the other side of Bishop's Castle that says, take time for fart wherever you be, for a want of a fart was the death of me. Why don't you go and see if you can find it? That stone is in every churchyard in the whole of Shropshire and Herefordshire. Right? And that comes out from time to time. Okay. So that's always been around. Okay.
So Norman's sort of saying books do capture stories, they need to be freed, and the need for story has never died, but the means of hearing stories has changed, and people sort of generally agreeing with that. And I do wonder why you think that that time seemed to be right. You know, that time, 89, 91, it just seemed to be really a turning point. And obviously it tells the Edgeton Festival, the Edgeton got started, but there were lots of little things all starting off in lots of places. So there was the mouth getting going. There was all the stuff that was happening in London with the Crick Crack Club and Apples and Snakes. Well, the forerunner of Apples and Snakes that, oh, it's gone out of my head now.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Group of people
Okay.
who were telling their with multicultural stories, and there seemed to be lots of different things popping up.
Right. The main point
You were aware of at that point that was just a tipping point of why that started to happen.
Right. There were two people involved, and the people from away, and I mean not from the England. You probably won't have heard of them. And the first one was Alan Berman, who was the artistic director to Sidmouth Folk Festival and Towersey Folk Festival. Malcolm Story, who did Whitby, who you had on a couple of weeks ago. Alan Bell, who did Fylde. And so the big folk, Davy Jones from Bromyard Folk Festival, they saw storytelling as part of the folk tradition. And they had the power and the clout to be able to say, we're having storyteller in our festivals. And that was as big a push as any single person did. So in Whitby, when you first went to Whitby, you were on a stage in a concert in the middle of the rugby club or the football club. You weren't round in the library or in the kids festival or anything else. You were
that as well.
Well, we all did, yeah, but that was part of it. But it was seen as part of the folk tradition that needed help. And so they gave it help. They didn't even think twice about it. They just gave it help. And they just wanted to, it's what they did. It was part of their DNA.
So I suppose, well, that's a how. I'm interested in the why, and so this is sort of the big question. I mean, we're all here, and we're all here talking to you, listening to you, because we love stories. But how would you define what storytelling tradition is and why it's important?
Wow, what it is.
Questions. I'm interested in your view, though, on this.
What it is a form of entertainment. And if it's not entertaining, it's boring and it shouldn't be done. So there's got to be a standard to it. So that's what it is. And it's for people who have the talent to be able to do it. Now, we all know musicians who picked up a fiddle when they were 3 and they can play fantastic music all their lives. There's some part in the storytelling world where you can stand up on your feet and tell a story and not particularly be worried about it, and know that it's going to be of a good standard. And we're not preachers either. We're not sort of whichever faith you want to be a part of. So we're not trying to preach to everything. So that leaves you to be entertaining. So first off, what it is an art form which is entertaining, which you can do in every location. So that's the first part of it. So what was the other part of the question? What is it?
Why is it important?
Why is it important? The past gives us the future. The present dictates how that future shall be. So it's always important to know the past and to learn the lessons of the past. You can go back to the old good wives. The old good wives knew a hell of a lot. That's why they were called good wives. They could cure children and they could do this and they could do that. Some of that medicine that they used in them days in the future is exactly the same medicine. It's just that today's science have turned it into tablets instead of cups of tea, and they can guarantee it to work. And when in the old days they had a 1 in 10 chance of doing it because they didn't know what they were trying to cure or things like that. So the present dictates how the future shall be. So what we've learned in the past, we can give to the future, but the present is going to turn it from 1978 to 2020 in my lifetime is how you do it. And that is a whole new, and that's what's changed, is how you do it more than what it is or what it should be. If that makes sense.
It kind of does. And I think you're quite interesting as a storyteller as well, because you do tell some really, really old stories and traditional stories and ones that you've collected. And that's been interesting here about Dougie Isles and Davy Jones, people that you've collected from. And I know that you've sort of collected from all sorts of people as you've gone along. And like you say, people will come and give you stories. So you've got those fabulous traditional stories. But but you've also, I think, and maybe this is from your father and kind of the after dinner speaking, been really open to the tradition just being continuing and evolving, and kind of before there was talk about personal stories and kind of personal stories coming over from America and the different styles there, you were telling quite a lot of contemporary stories, and your repertoire has always had quite a lot of jokes in it, and stories about cricket, which you seem to put on a par with kind of, you know, like 1,000-year-old mythic stories. They would kind of occupy the same level of importance in your repertoire.
Yeah, well, the cricketing stories can go back to the 1920s. And some of the Hopper Leggett was 1925 or something like that. You know, the cricketing stories go back a long way, and so do some of the sporting stories. And then it comes under the class of being entertaining as well, because if you're sat in a cricket club, telling a few cricket stories is probably quite a good thing to do. And Dad used to do cricket club AGMs, where and I went to a couple of them. And our local cricket club was Church Stretton I played for. Elmley Castle is where the bench is, Dad's bench, which is in Worcestershire. So tell the story that's on the tip of your tongue, because that's the story that's going to match the audience and where you are, was what Dad used to say. So if he was in a rugby club, he'd tell rugby stories, and he'd tell banking stories to bankers and never get paid. So, but his was, I can't say he was a storyteller and we're a family of storytellers. I've never said that. The way he did it and the way that I do it is completely different. So I'm not trying to claim he was a storyteller like we are, because he wasn't. So.
No, but all the time that I've known you, you have told stories that you've got from him, and that's been just part of your influence and part of your environment and part of what, you know, what's made you who you are.
Well, yeah, but when I went into the club one day, and Dad and Reg Barry, who was a farmer from Elmley Castle, was sat in the pub up here in Shropshire, and it's an hour's drive away. And when I was down in Elmley Castle, Worcester Jerry used to come over, and we'd all go off up into Guyton Power, which is up on the Farmers Arms at Guyton Power, which is up on the Cotswolds. And there's an awful lot of horsey people up there, because it's to do with Cheltenham and the racing, Amy. And they tell stories all the time. The jockey, you get a bunch of people who own horses and stables and stuff like that. They're forever telling stories. A lot of personal ones, but they don't mind you. They're quite happy for you to chuck a traditional one in. They love it. They absolutely do. Yeah.
So you've referenced loads of stories while we've been sat here, and there are lots more questions that I want to ask you. And by the way, I mean, there's also a Q&A at the bottom here. So if I occasionally might miss things on the chat, if you've got a question that you want to ask Mike at the end, do put it up on the Q&A, and then I'll unmute you at the end and get some questions from the floor for Mike.
Right, well, it's now 9:15. I'm here for the rest of the evening. So if you want to go and have a chat afterwards, I'll get a beer out and we'll keep chatting. So it's up to you. I've just noticed what the time is, and we haven't got to Duncan yet at all, which I thought was the reason that you persuaded me to do with this, was to talk about Duncan.
Well, no, I'm just taking the tradition on, and you're a big part of the tradition. Well, right. I was going to ask you for a story, but if you want to talk about Duncan, I'm always happy to talk about Duncan.
Right, there's two things we've got to say first. Then you haven't asked me the question I've got the answer for. All right, so I'm going to answer that. I'm going to answer it, and you can ask me the question. We'll do it the other way around. What is the tradition?
I did just ask you that.
Right. Then I've got more to say about it then in that case. Okay. What is the tradition? I can't tell you what the tradition is. I can tell you what it isn't. Now, we've had long discussions in my lifetime about this, and I get this from the people that came before me. David Jones was one, and one of the others. What the tradition isn't is somebody saying at that time, in that place, this is where it stops. So you go back to 1988 and you're in a pub in the middle of Hereford and someone sings a song and they say, great, that's a traditional song. It's going to stay like that for the rest of its time. That's what it isn't. All right. The tradition evolves now. And then they say I was told by others to mention my first house. Well, my first house had a hole in the roof and it didn't have a telephone. Right. In the 21st century, I'm talking to you on Zoom, which is probably bouncing off a satellite and coming back down again. So the tradition has to live in 1970 and it has to live in 2020. And it has to evolve through that time to get to where it is. Otherwise, it's not going to continue. So what the tradition is, I don't know, but I do know it has to evolve. So it should be called the evolving tradition, and you've got to leave it better than you find it.
Fair enough.
Right, that was the bit you asked me for. Okay.
Well, I think that ties in very well with what you were saying before, and about, you know, kind of leaving it better than you found it, and being really happy that there is like a storytelling club now in every county, and that all of the history press books and people telling the stories of the land where they come, and really sharing those and swapping those. And I have to say that we've suddenly, with this lockdown, there's suddenly been a lot more conversation and connection between different countries. And with the World Storytelling Cafe, and, you know, with Norman and Janice being here tonight, there's been a lot of hands reaching out all over the world, and storytellers swapping stories, and I think that's fantastic. And Heather's on here, and I love this. In Scotland, we call the tradition the carrying stream, and that is, it's a lovely image.
Yeah, they do up there. Yeah, I've heard that before. Yeah, they do up there. Yeah. Right. I was going to tell you a story, but I wanted to mention Duncan because he's in it. So I first met Duncan because I'd met a lot of the other storytellers first, because I met Johnny Campbell, I'd met Packy Byrne, I'd met Eddie Lenahan and Liz Weir in Ireland. And I'd met, because I'd been running the festival for a couple of years or so, we knew quite a few of the storytellers in England and all sorts of things. And so I phoned him up. I got Taffy to do me an introduction. I phoned him up. Linda said, write a letter. So we wrote a letter, and a phone went a week later, and Linda said, we want you to come, but we want you to bring your family. And this was about the first time, because I'd done most of this without Lynn being involved, but Lynn came to see Duncan for the first time, and we drove to Scotland, and he was at in the Kingdom of Fifeshire, Achimukti, around there, wherever he was. And Linda and Lynn got on very well because their backgrounds were quite similar. Because Lynn was a teacher, or is a teacher still, and Linda had done all her academic, she was writing the books and everything else. And Anna and Jake were about the same size as Tommy and Amy, isn't it? Duncan's. Betsy. Betsy was a bit older. So Tommy and Anna were about the same age, and Jake was a bit younger. And on the Saturdays when we went up there, they just went into Dundee on the train. And they went to the swimming baths and things like that, and left me and Duncan by ourselves, whoever else was in the house. I think Linda went with them to get a bit of a break. Remember right? Okay. So we got on, and then I arranged for Duncan to come down to the Fete and to go to Whitby. It was me who got Duncan to come down to Whitby. So,
yeah, well, I know that it was you that got Duncan to go to Fest of the Edge, which is where I met him for the first time.
Yeah, well, it was an obvious choice to come down. And like all the other storytellers.
About him. Where did you first kind of know that there was this Scottish guy to go and see?
Well, there were three of them up there, because there was David Campbell, Duncan himself, and Stanley Robertson. And they were the three men. And there was another couple as well. There was a piper called
Willie McPhee.
Who we did try to come down, but he couldn't come for some reason. We tried a couple of times to get him to. There's Padraig O'Neill, who was like Duncan's apprentice. He liked to call himself Duncan's apprentice for a while. And there was another couple. We were looking really, and there was Sheila Stewart. Now, Sheila and Duncan didn't get on very well. So Sheila came to the first couple of fetes, but they didn't really get on very well. And so the year that Duncan came down there, Sheila didn't. And she didn't because she'd been twice, and we didn't invite her the third time, because we never invited people more than twice. And Mary Medlicott was coming up from London and all sorts of things. So it was an obvious choice to come down, and very well regarded. And I'm sure he sold a lot of tickets as well, which was one of the other reasons we got him, because he was quite well known, and where he turned up, people would come and listen. So. But he was also really amenable. You know, Duncan, he was so easy to have around because he'd go on the story walk and things like that. Some of the others, who come up from London or from the big cities, they're going back to that theatre. Well, we'll stand in a tent and we'll tell stories to 250 people, but we're not going to go on a story walk, and we're not going to sit in a cafe in Wenlock, and we're not going to stand in a pub, and we're not going to do this. You got a whole long list of we're not going to do these. Right, Duncan.
Right, so steering you away from that.
Yeah, Duncan would just turn up and go, yeah, and if you got any trouble, call me out. And he'd be around the bonfire, and he'd be in the bar, and he'd go on the story walk. Even if he wasn't booked, he'd go along and tell a story there, because he just liked talking to people. He was so easy to have about.
But before he came down, you were saying that you also, when you first met him, you felt that you had a different connection with him than most storytellers because you had quite similar background.
Oh, right. Yeah. I'd worked with the gypsies before, or the traveling folk, whatever we're going to call. I call them the gypsies. And when I was in, I used to work on a farm at Wyke down in Pershore. And I was
Well, in Pershore, they probably were the gypsies, and in
no,
Scotland.
Malcolm Meikle, I saw 3 weeks ago. He's in his 90s now. His son Tom is just retiring. He's in his 60s. Tom was about 12 in those days. And the same family of the traveling peoples stay at that farm all summer and have done since 1946. And they come and it's part of their circle of things that they do. And they've changed their surnames now, because it used to be, I think they were the Swifts or the Joneses or something, in the Griffithses or something. Now they're sort of Nyla Bailey. And you still go down there in the summer and you'll see the benders on the side of the roads and the horses and stuff like that. So I worked with them down in the Forestry Dean. When I was in the Forestry Commission, we came across a few then, and I worked for Chipperfield's, the circus people in England and in France. And the circus people and the gypsy traveling people are very similar in that they overwinter somewhere and spend the rest of the day on the road. And so their sense of humours and everything else the same. So by the time I got to Duncan, I wasn't going to see the great Scottish storyteller that he was. I was going to see one of the travelling folk I thought I'd get on with really well, and I did. And we would talk about, you go out in the car and you talk about all sorts of things. He and I would go out in the car and we talk about someone's laid that hedge in the wrong way and stuff like that, and we talk about horses and stuff. And he knew Fred Jordan quite well. He'd met Fred Jordan as well, who was another of my mentors. All right. And so we could talk about horses. I don't know much about horses, but I did know a little bit. Duncan knew a lot more than I did. But he also knew about wildflowers and things like that. He knew the things that grew in the forest. Well, I knew that because I was working as a forester. So that's how, so we got on quite well. Our backgrounds, we had enough in common to make a friendship, which is what we did. So, okay.
Yeah, and I think you both have got a real love of the land and a real knowledge of trees and what to do with trees and how to look after them. And I think, from having seen you together, you really did have that as a connection. And I have to say, you mentioned very briefly there about the circus. We haven't got time to do it now.
I know, I missed it out. Yeah.
At an event with Mike Rust and then buy him a pint and ask him about the safari park, and you will get a very, very good return on that pint of beer. You should definitely hear some of the safari park stories because they're absolutely hilarious. Well, yeah. So we both spent a lot of time with Duncan, and I mean, he was a wonderful man. But we are coming to the end of the time. I promised that people could put some questions up on the Q&A if they wanted to, and we haven't got very long for a story, but we have still got time for a story if you would like to tell us one, because you did promise one. Okay, I'm going to tell you this one, and it is a personal story, Amy, but I think it shows you the measure of Duncan as much as anything, because Duncan used to come down to Whitby. And we used to spend a lot of time with Whitby. He used to spend 2 hours every lunchtime telling stories together and things like that. But it was at Whitby that I heard that Dave Jones had died. Now, Dave was my friend and he was my mentor, and I was really upset about it. I knew he'd been unwell for a long time. He had an abscess in his brain. But it was Malcolm Story himself who took the time to come and tell me that Dave had died. And I looked at it and he said, Mike, he said, you have to do what we all do. And you get some really bad news, go and find a beach and walk on it. Scrap the rest of the day, just go and do that. So I went and did that, and I just disappeared for a while. Lynn and the kids, they were doing something else. And I found out later that at the same time that Malcolm had told me, he'd taken the time to go and tell Duncan. And Duncan walked all around Whitby looking for me, and he couldn't find me. And in the end, he found me on a bench right out by the sea there. If you know Whitby, they've got some quays that go out there. And he came and sat down alongside me on the bench. And he said, Mike, he said, life is but like a caterpillar. And I looked at him, I really did, because just at that moment in my time and everything else, I wasn't really interested in listening to a folky story. There's not many times in my life I'm going to say that, but at that particular moment, at that time, I just didn't want to know.
and I was a bit harsh with him. And he didn't say anything else. He just got a cigarette out and he rolled it, and he didn't say anything for about an hour. And in the end, he turned round and he said, Lynn's going to be coming back to the cottage soon. And he said, you know, Mike, life is but like a caterpillar. And I went, go on then, Duncan, tell me what you want to say. And what he said was this, that life is but like a caterpillar. And what a caterpillar does is just grub around in the cold, wet soil. And it gets something to eat when it can. And in the end, it doesn't die, it turns into a chrysalis. And that's what it's like for us. That you're here down on earth and you're just grubbing around doing the best you can to get something to eat and to keep warm and to be happy and to have a drink from time to time and all the rest of it. And then you'll die. But you don't actually die, because the chrysalis turns into a butterfly. And just have a look at a butterfly, Mike, because a butterfly is here in a warm day and there's the sun on its wings, and it goes from a beautiful flower to a beautiful flower to a beautiful flower, drinking nectar. And if there's one thing that's the happiest beast that anywhere on this planet, it's the butterfly. Life is but like a butterfly, because we're down here, then you turn into a chrysalis, and then you go to heaven. And your friend Davy said, who I never met, is in heaven. Think of butterflies. And that's what he told me that day overlooking the beach.
That sounds very Duncan and very beautiful.
Okay.
And I have to say, there's a lot of ghosts in the room at the moment, actually, because we've got Duncan with us sitting on one side, we've got Davy sitting with us. And I don't know if you know this, I don't know if you noticed, Mike, but Kate is with us. Kate Moggs is.
No, I did tell her, but I hadn't seen her. I texted her the other day. So can you put me back on side by side, Amy?
Yeah, you are. You might need to do it on your own computer, but you're side by side on everybody else's. At least I hope you are.
Right, I come back. Right, okay, yes, okay.
So for those of you who don't know.
Hello, Katie. Hello, Katie. Yeah, okay.
Because we were talking about Richard Walker, who was just very influential in Shropshire and a really big impact on me. And one of my first mentors, really with you, with you, Mike. I did my work experience with Richard Walker, who was also he ran the folk programme on Radio Shropshire, and he was absolutely. He was your partner in crime setting up Tales at the Edge and Festival at the Edge, and Richard's still very much missed, and he's still sort of one of those storytelling people. And if Kate's waving back, hello. So storytellers will often talk about kind of, standing at the front and having all the ancestors kind of behind them, and quite often people say it in quite a very serious way. And when people used to talk about that, I used to have this image of these silent ghosts kind of stretching back into the great beyond. And now I've got quite a lot of my own ghosts and my own ancestors in storytelling, and storytelling ghosts are bloody loud. They don't lie easy. They might be butterflies, but they don't hesitate. Well, none of my ghosts anyway. They're all pretty forward in coming up with all the things that I should be doing and shouldn't be doing, and exactly what they think of what I've just said. So I don't know if everybody else's storytelling ghosts are the same. But I've definitely kind of got Richard and Duncan standing behind me, and I'm sure you've got Duncan and definitely Dave Jones.
I can live with them a long time. Davey there's always been someone in the back of my mind for years and years and years, and I didn't realise who it was, because I didn't realise it might be Davey. But on the whole, you have to be also, you go talking about this stuff in the normal world, they'd send you to a psychiatric ward probably. Okay, so you have to be careful about what they are.
Very much. That's why I'm here. Yeah.
So you have to be sometimes careful what they're saying to you and what they're telling you to do and all the rest of it. So they have to be kept on a short leash. And so sometimes they're put on a short leash. I
was very good at bickering with Duncan when he was alive, and I still bicker with him now. So that's
yeah, okay, yeah, all right. But Worcester Jerry used to talk about the pub in heaven, which were all the storytellers. It's called the Golden Harp. So when you get to heaven, you go and find the Golden Harp, and they're all sat in there having a drink. So
yeah, I think it's going to be some party waiting for us when we finally get there. But I'm not in a hurry, I have to say.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah, so I'm not intending to go there this week. No.
And that seems it seems almost a fitting place to leave it. Except I know that you wanted to talk about the future of storytelling, and actually kind of, that's kind of, we've come to quite a mellow sad moment, and it would be really good to look into the future. And what do you think the future is? You've brought it, not single-handedly, but you've been part of bringing it to where storytelling to where it is now. Where do you think it is going, and where does it need to go?
Right. Not that we want to be controversial. I've tried not to be controversial in all the way of doing this, but my view on it is, I've been asked a couple of times, do I think storytelling is an art form? Right. Now, my opinion is that the spoken word is the art form, and that storytelling is part of that. Now, what I was saying earlier was that I thought that the job done with the revival, there's storytelling clubs in every county in England, there's storytelling books, there's storytellings all over and everything else. And I think there's some brilliant storytellers doing some brilliant work. I really do. And my admiration. And I think also as a nation, you need to look broader than just the storytelling scene. It can bring people together. You can bring different cultures and different peoples, the cities and the countries, the Muslims and the Christians, the men and the women, the North and the South, whichever way you want to do it, the people who live on the coast and the Midland people, all the rest of it. I think it can all bring people together. But I don't think you need to restrict it. The comedians call us the folk storytellers because they call themselves storytellers. You know, if you go to the comedians and you talk to them and you say, what do they do? And they say, we tell stories and we're the storytellers. And there's another bunch of people called the folk storytellers, but they're no good because they're not funny, is what they say. They're not comedic, right? And you can go to the church people and who do sermons and they will say, right, not a problem at all. We do something like you do every Sunday, but it's got to have a point to it. And some of the stories that we have, as you know, have got points to them. So the over top of it, I call it the spoken word. So I think that's the way forward. And I think the concerts that we've been doing, that you've been leading on the Thursday, where you have some poetry, we had some stories, we had a song from Kath, and we had some music from Heather because she was playing her harp. I think that there's another couple of things I want to get into the concerts, but that's pretty much going forward. Plus the opportunity for someone, because it's like brain food, as you said to me, to do an hour's show or a 2 hour show. And some of the other things to do is tell stories in a pub and go on a walk and get an eco storyteller to walk through the forest and take the children from the inner cities and let them go through the forests. And learn a bit about it. So getting people to meet and to mix up, I think is with the spoken word is the way I see it forward.
Okay, which is okay. I mean, I've got this banner sort of sat behind me, which I've had in most of the Taking the Tradition on that I've done, and the Get A Word In Edgeways spoken word concerts, because this is the Get A Word In Edgeways Zoom account, which I haven't particularly mentioned that because you're on anyway, but you know, Get A Word In Edgeways have paid for the Zoom and are sponsoring this in that way, but it has got lots of things that are wrong on it. They will now be changing. Of course.
Well, I'll get a new one. Free camping isn't wrong. That's going to be right. Okay.
I'm going to give me a chance, man. What I was just going to say, obviously, the festival is not happening at Stokes Barn this year, but it will be happening next year. And also, in consultation with the farmers, which is completely brilliant, is you have managed to, the farmers have said, all right, we couldn't have done it this year, but next year, we think that we can get the site cleared. It'll be a bit of a rush, so that we can do it a week earlier, which gives you more chance to work with the schools. And I mean, Shropshire is going to be quite an exciting place, I think, next summer, because there'll be Get A Word In Edgeways one weekend, and then the next weekend at Hopton Wafers will be Festival at the Edge, which leaves a week in between. And there's so many fantastic spoken word venues in Shropshire, I have to say, because there's Myth Stories. We've got Myth Stories, which is the first museum of myth and legend in England, who are completely fabulous. There's the Arvin Foundation, who do writing workshops. In Bishop's Castle, we've got the Emergency Poet, and she's moved in, which is just fantastic. And I think Shropshire can really be a hub and a centre for spoken word. And so, you know, everybody come to Shropshire, just book that whole kind of, you know, book that week off, bookend it with a festival at either weekend, and there's going to be some exciting things in that middle bit.
Yeah, but we can have poetry as well, and creative writing and stuff like that as well. And I want to try and get the kids to drop some of the mobile phones and things and spend a day without any device, walk into the woods
Well,
and all
that fits
sorts
in
of
quite
stuff.
well, as Paul's just put up, that yeah, at A Word In Edgeways next summer, it's going to be the relaunch of the Young Storyteller of the Year
Yes. Yeah,
competition,
absolutely.
which
Yeah.
is a fantastic event, and has been instrumental, I think, in the careers of so many young storytellers. But it's not about whether you want to be a professional storyteller of the Young Storyteller of the Year. It's just been a wonderful thing that has and because I've been involved with quite a lot of projects, and it gives young people so much self-confidence and interest, and gives them stories to tell that they can draw on later in life, and they can go off and into hundreds of different careers, but they've still got that as one of their foundation stones, and a little bit of sense of who they are and where they come from, and a bit of confidence to talk and having a story to share. Like you said earlier on, you don't just get stories, you have to swap stories, and if you haven't got any stories, it's very difficult to get stories from other people.
Yeah, he did say that. Yeah.
And in these times when we are getting more global, and obviously at the moment there's been all sorts of stuff in the news and about Black Lives Matter, and there's still so many tensions, that if people feel they have a story and they have something to share, and somebody else has got a story to give back, opening those channels of communication is just always going to be the way forward. It's just a brilliant way to at least start conversations.
Yeah.
So Shane saying, I work with children, and even preteen children want to tell, and an opening for this would be good. I do as well, and having a goal and somewhere to celebrate children and young people's work is just fantastic. It's a really amazing thing, and that's the other thing about bringing the festival forward a week, is that it's within term time, and it's much easier to sort of get children there. So we've had lots of lovely comments. It's been a fantastic hour. It always goes too fast. Nobody's put any questions on the QA, so if you have got any questions that you're burning to ask Mike, you better get typing quick, because this is your last opportunity.
Mike's going to go and have a beer. That's what Mike's going to do. Okay. Right, well, you did it. You persuaded me to do it. I wasn't going to do this, but you persuaded me to do it. So well done, Amy. And you're doing a sterling job getting all these people together, and no one seems to say it very much to you, so I'd like to say it. So I think you're doing a fantastic job getting all these people to talk, even with people like me who didn't particularly want to, but you're getting us here to do it. So well done.
Well, I'm really pleased that you're here, Mike, because you have had a really pivotal role in the storytelling resurgence, and lots of people are saying, thank you very much. A beer, there's a surprise, Mike. Yeah. Well, I might be going to, actually, I'm not going to have a beer tonight, because I've got I'm at school tomorrow. I've got online sessions with children at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, so I bet I'm going to go to bed. But Linda has got one question. She's dived in really quickly on the Q&A to say, have you written any stories yourself, Mike?
No. What I tend to do is I'll get a story from, say, the Highlands of Scotland, for instance, as we're talking about Duncan, and I do tell some of his stories, but he'll tell us a story about the River Spey and the mountains and the glens up there. Well, I've never been there, and I don't understand, and I need to see pretty much what I'm telling. So I will take that story and I'll put it in Shropshire, because I can see the Wenlock Edge from where I'm sat now, and I know the people, and I know the ponds, and I know the fish and the flowers and all the rest of it. So people who say, I've never heard that story before, but they will have done lots of times. They're just based in the glens of Antrim, or on the west coast of Ireland, or from Iceland, or somewhere like that. But now it's properly in Shropshire. So I do that a bit, right, from time to time, because it makes it easier for me. Okay.
And that's a very interesting one to end on, because that brings up a whole other contentious kind of
right. Okay.
But that is something people have traditionally done, I think, for years and years and years. And I am going to finish it off. But
the sailors do it. The sailors do it all the time.
They do. And I also just wanted to say, kind of, I have often assumed that you have done that when I've asked you for stories, and though Linda, although might not have written stories of his own, when I was researching stories for my books, I've done a couple of books of Shropshire folklore. Mike's always my first port of call, and that's been a great time when people, when Mike said, "Oh, but you know that story," and I go, "No," and I've heard stories and I thought he's made that up, or he's moved that from somewhere else just to give me a story because I need one now, and I'll go and then once I've got that thread to pull and to follow, every single time when you've done that for me, I found that actually it's opened up another world, and all of these different stories, a bit of folklore that I just did not know, and that actually it's always been absolutely based on founded in proper, I'm not sure about fact, but proper folklore and age-old folklore. So you do that sometimes, but you also know stories that other people just don't know.
Well, the only stories that, yes, because I went and found them, or they came and found me. And you have to be proactive sometimes about this. You can't just sit there and say, oh, you know, just sit there and it'll turn up in my life. You have to drive from Ledbury to Kington and go and find an old boy in a pub. You know, you have to do that.
Or out to buy your beer.
Yeah, well, cider, or go and find Dougie Isles in the Dean and stuff like that.
Well,
which Linda? Which Linda is that? Is that Linda Williamson? Is that Duncan's? Right.
No, I think that this is Linda Golden.
Oh, okay. Right. Hello, Linda. Right.
Who you will probably know from Whitby.
Yes.
That Linda?
No, it's Linda Hall.
Huh?
Oh, I know Linda. She's an old friend of mine. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, Linda. We're giving you all sorts of different identities. So, well, thank you very much, Mike. So it's been great to have your company tonight, but it's also been great to have the company of Dougie Isles and David Jones and Duncan and Richard Walker, and to brought all of those people into the room. And as ever, there's questions that I was planning to ask and we never quite got round to.
Right.
But it's been a really great evening, and I've learned things that I didn't know. And just thank you to everybody for coming and joining us and for joining the chat.
Yes, I must admit, far more people have turned up to listen to me than I ever thought. So thank you very much for spending an hour in my company. I do really appreciate it. Thank you.
And we will be back next week. Well, I will be back next week, taking the tradition on is every Tuesday at 8 p.m. And I know exactly
who you got. Who you got?
Well, I can't quite announce it because although he said he's going to do it, he hasn't agreed. He hasn't confirmed that he's going to do it next week. But I will give you some clues. The person that I'm hoping to have was slow getting back to me because he was busy housekeeping his 42 hard drives, on which he has a wealth of video and audio recordings of folk festivals and folk performers from all over Britain.
Doc Rowe. Rowe.
Well,
if we've got Doc Rowe, I'm going to come and listen. He's amazing.
I can't possibly confirm that until my mystery guest has confirmed.
I'll get Malcolm to text him.
But whoever we have, and hopefully it will be a certain person with 42 hard drives. Yes. Next week will be fantastic. And then the week after, we've got Joseph Sobol, who's the director of Geeks. And after that, we have Shona Lee, the last known Dritzilla of the Jewish tradition. So lots and lots coming up on Taking the Tradition On. Go and get your beer, Mike. Everybody else, go and raise your glasses to all the storytellers who came before us. Thank you for your company, and thank you for helping me to take the tradition on. And we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye all. Thank you for listening.